Okay, so welcome to today's colloquium. Today's speaker is Professor Frank von Hippel from Princeton University, who has spent almost 50 years working on nuclear arms control and non-proliferation as an activist and as an advisor. And during the 80s, he worked with Mikhail Gorbachev, physicist advisors on ending the Cold War nuclear arms race. And during 93 and 94, he was responsible for nuclear issues in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. For those of you who are interested, at the end of the colloquium, there will be a discussion, 15-30 minutes discussion with Professor Stuart Prager and Charles Selton, who are members of the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. So please, Professor Frank von Hippel, you can start.
Thank you very much, Monica. I'm going to share my screen.
Perfect.
Yeah, okay. Let me just go back. Okay, so many of us, most of us, thought that the danger of nuclear war went away with the end of the Cold War. Unfortunately, it didn't. This is why a group of us in the United States has established a physicist coalition for nuclear threat reduction to help physicists educate themselves and then educate our government about the dangers and how we might reduce them. And so the talk I'm going to give is based on the talk that we have given at 100 U.S. universities so far, a group of 10 of us or so, and as a result of which, when I last checked, about 850 physicists had joined our coalition to educate themselves and to educate Congress. I'll just show you the outline. I won't read it. Just give you a chance to read it quickly of what my talk will look like. And as Monica indicated, at the end, for those who have an activist gene and would like to consider either joining our coalition or setting up parallel efforts in Europe or elsewhere, we'll have a session. Please stay on, and we'll have a session joined by the chairman of our coalition, Stuart Prager, another professor at Princeton, and Charlotte Selton, who manages our coalition for the American Physical Society, which originally sponsored it. The consequences of a nuclear war would be horrendous, and we have one official estimate that was made public by Daniel Ellsberg, the famous whistleblower, that in 1961, in response to a question from President Kennedy, the U.S. Strategic Command estimated that its only attack plan at the time would kill 400 million people in the Soviet Union, China, and Eastern Europe, plus about 200 million in Western Europe, Japan, and South Asia from radioactive fallout, depending on which way the wind blew. Ellsberg called this 100 holocausts. This was just the U.S. attack plan at the time. Our U.S. megatonnage is down by a factor of 10 today, but that estimate that Strategic Command, Air Command made, now called Strategic Command, did not include the effects of fire or economic collapse. And when you take those into account, the effects of a large-scale nuclear war between the United States and Russia, for example, today, it would be billions of deaths. This is one of the targets, certainly corresponds to the kind of U.S. targets. U.S. is targeted on the Kremlin. This shows the effects of a modern 500 kiloton. This is a warhead with the same explosive powers as 500,000 tons of chemical explosive over the Pentagon, which would be a key command node which the Russians would certainly want to destroy. And what I show here in the circles are the scaled areas of death from Hiroshima, scaled in the case of the blast by the 1/3 power, radius by the 1/3 power, in the case of heat and the firestorm by the 1/2 power. And you see that the whole Washington area would be destroyed, and on the order of 1 million deaths from this single explosion alone. I hear at the bottom I have a quote when this is a thermonuclear warhead that we're talking about, and there was a debate and in the United States about whether it was moral to try to develop these weapons, and there was the General Advisory Committee to the Atomic Energy Commission considered this, and two of the members, Enrico Fermi and Isidore Rabi, another famous physicist, said necessarily such a weapon goes far beyond any military objective and it enters the range of very great natural catastrophes. By its very nature, it cannot be confined to a military objective, but becomes a weapon which in practical effect is almost one of genocide. And I think this figure illustrates that they were right. Unfortunately, they were overruled. The arms race was on. The argument was that the Soviets were going to develop this weapon. We had to as well. Or actually, the original argument was the Soviet Union had developed and tested in 1949 a counterpart to the Nagasaki weapon, U.S. Nagasaki weapon, and therefore we had to have something which was superior to that. The most of the warheads in the U.S. and Russian arsenal are targeted on their counterparts. This shows the fallout patterns from an attack on the various Russian nuclear weapons related facilities. The big long 1,000 kilometers radioactive fallout areas are downwind from missile silos, which I'll talk groups of missile silos, which I'll talk about later. This target, and this does not include targets in cities, which would be inevitably, like the Pentagon I showed you, be included, would by itself cause 8 to 10 million deaths. Then, since the 1980s, there's been the issue of climate effects of a nuclear war. And there's a group that has been modeling these effects. And in fact, recently I was able to get Congress to ask the National Academy of Sciences to do a review of these calculations. The first review in 40 years. But this shows a couple of maps from one of the academic calculations that have been made. And on the top, it shows the climate zones in the absence of a nuclear war. And the bottom, it shows and what they assumed was that 400 megatons, 400 million tons chemical explosive equivalent over cities would cause 100 million tons of soot to be lofted into the stratosphere with a 7-year half-life. And then they calculated, and then that would disperse around the northern hemisphere. And then they calculated what the effects would be on the growing season. And you can see in the bottom figure that basically in the northern hemisphere, the growing season would be reduced to the growing season in Antarctica. Essentially, there wouldn't be a growing season. And this would, I mean, as we've seen, just the disruption from the Ukraine war of the grain exports from Ukraine, you can only imagine what would happen if all the grain growing areas in the northern hemisphere got destroyed. So the consequences are horrendous, would be horrendous. And so then the question is, what are the probabilities? And here, my main concern is not a deliberate nuclear war, but an accidental nuclear war. And we've had some close calls. And I'd like to start with the fact that U.S. and Russian intercontinental ballistic missiles are in a launch on warning posture. And the reason is, I show here on the map on the left the areas in which U.S. has 450 missile silos, like the one pictured on the right, with ICBMs in them, and you can see these silos from on Google Earth even, and they can be targeted, and therefore, as in the 1970s, as we saw Soviet missiles become more accurate, our missiles in the late 70s were put on temporarily on a launch on warning posture, so that the flight time of a ICBM from Soviet Union at the time to the U.S. Would be about 30 minutes, and so the decision time actually within that 30 minutes would the president's decision time was determined to be less than 10 minutes. So could there be an accidental a misperception that there was a launch, that there was an incoming Soviet attack? The answer is yes. And in fact, we had a number of false alarms. In the case of the U.S., the best known one in which a training tape was loaded into the early warning computers without telling the early warning crews, and all of a sudden they saw what they'd been trained to expect. And in another U.S. case, a chip started, which was broadcasting zero incoming missiles, failed and started broadcasting 222 incoming missiles. And in the case of the Soviet Union, the most famous case, when they had their early warning satellites, which are supposed to see the infrared, on infrared sensors, the plumes of the boosters of the ICBM boosters, they thought they saw such plumes coming out of the U.S. missile silos. It turned out to be the sun reflecting on clouds. In all these three cases, we know that the early warning boosts took more time than they were allowed. They did save the world by concluding that that there were false warnings, but they were fired because they took too long. In Europe, there was an exercise, a NATO exercise in 1983, which was a command exercise, which was supposed to end with fighter bombers taking NATO fighter bombers taking off with nuclear weapons for Eastern Europe. The Soviet leadership mistook that as a real plans for attack. It was a time of high tension, and they loaded nuclear weapons into their fighter bombers for a preemptive attack. Fortunately, they figured out it was not a real plan, a real attack coming. So we've had false alarms. We've also had nuclear threats in military crises. In 1961, the U.S. prepared for nuclear war because the Soviet Union was blocking access to West Berlin. I mean, I see today Taiwan as a trigger point for a potential nuclear war with China. In 1962, the most famous crisis happened, and it happened as a result of the U.S. announcing during the Berlin crisis that the U.S. had nuclear superiority, and that we knew how few missiles the Soviet Union had and how vulnerable they were. And so the Soviet leadership decided to move, since they only had a few intercontinental ballistic missiles at the time, they decided to move medium and intermediate range missiles into Cuba to try to rectify the imbalance. And that caused that very scary crisis where there were a number of events which almost triggered a nuclear war. And now we, of course, this has come to, we have President Putin threatening, making nuclear threats if NATO support for Ukraine becomes intolerable to him. So now just like to talk briefly about ballistic missile defense and the folly of ballistic missile defense. This figure shows the sort of a graph of U.S. expenditures in constant dollars on ballistic missile defense. We spent a total of about $350 billion so far. These have each time been presidential initiatives. The science advisors have consistently advised that these systems that were proposed for deployment could be easily countered, penetrated, but the presidents went ahead anyway. And then as a result of the first experience in 1972, there was actually an agreement between the US and the Soviet Union not to deploy more than 100 warhead interceptors, which would have been a negligible number, considering that we each had thousands, tens of thousands of warheads in that period. But then in 2002, with the Cold War ended, the U.S. concerns turned to North Korea, a possible attack from North Korea, and President Bush Jr. took us out of that treaty, the ABM treaty, and the results has been the reason we got into the 1972 ABM treaty was to prevent an offense-defense race. And we now have an offense-defense race with both Russia and China. Sorry for all the bad news. Now, these systems, the current systems, are focused on interception in space. And in space, you could accompany a warhead with lots of light objects. Here shown luminized balloons, and which could be at various temperatures, because there is some heating effect from the warhead which is hidden in one of the balloons. And that's an example of this simple so-called penetration aids that could be used, and that the U.S. intelligence community judged would be within the reach of any country that could develop an ICBM, so including North Korea. Now, recently, I participated in an American Physical Society review of the current situation with ballistic missile defense. And our report concluded that few of the main challenges involved in developing and deploying a reliable and effective ballistic missile defense have been solved, and many of the hard problems we have identified are likely to remain unsolved during and probably beyond the 15-year time horizon we consider. So this is one of the issues that we want to educate Congress about again. We, just as the public is much less educated since the end of the Cold War, there's been a complete turnover in Congress. And so we have to start from scratch again in educating Congress. This is just a brief overview of shows the total number of warheads, the history of the total number of warheads, almost all US and Soviet, Russian. And you can see at the bottom, there are 7 other countries with nuclear weapons, but on this scale, it's hard to see those lines, and they total, the other 7 countries total and collectively have about 1,000 warheads, compared to US. And US actually declares the number of warheads in its stockpile. It's about 4,000, and it's estimated that Russia has about the same. But still, plenty to destroy civilization. And unfortunately, however, the reductions, I think the reductions have ended. And this is one troublesome recent development in China. China has had only a few tens of missiles able to reach the United States, and was satisfied with that for decades. And now all of a sudden, in 2021, we found that the Chinese were building hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missile silos in the desert, northern and western areas. And the most likely candidate for missile being installed in those silos is shown, the DF-41 shown in the bottom left. The tension between the US and China is over Taiwan. And my belief is that a major motivator of China's buildup is concerns about the US missile defense. Worst case analysis have shown that their technical people understand that they can be easily neutralized, but the worst case analysts in Beijing say, well, what if the Americans figure out how to make it work? So this is the history of China's the number of China's warheads able to reach the United States. And you on the right, I show you what our Department of Defense is currently projecting, China going up to about 1,000 warheads by 2030, based, I think, on the assumption that a three warhead missile would be put into each of those 300 silos. So in the U.S., and there's no real change. I mean, basically the intercontinental ballistic missiles, the ballistic missile submarines, which I haven't mentioned, but they carry most of the U.S. warheads, and the bombers, nuclear bombers, are all aging out and are being replaced, and on the assumption, I mean, the apparent assumption that things will go on like this for another 50 years, 50, 60 years. And here I just show you that the percentage of the Department of Defense budget that has been devoted to nuclear weapons historically, and with the original buildup in the 1950s and 60s, the Reagan-Bush modernization in the 1980s, and then now the replacement of most of that hardware by so-called modernized hardware. The original buildup, which was to a huge level, we had about 30,000 warheads in the early mid 1960s. The attempt was to save money because of concerns about the Soviet Union, all the hundreds of divisions of Soviet army, the threat that they might invade Western Europe. The U.S. did not want to make that kind of investment to balance out the Soviet Union, and so nuclear weapons were embraced as more bang for the buck, which they certainly are. Sorry. So, what would I like to do about all this? I'd like the U.S. and other countries to develop a no first use policy with regard to nuclear weapons, a no launch on warning policy, that we have we have one last arms control agreement, U.S.-Russian arms control agreement, which expires in 2026. I would like a new one. I'd like us to be able to engage China in nuclear arms limitations, limit ballistic missile defense again to prevent an offense-defense arms race. I note that the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which in August will have the delayed 50-year review of the status of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, it required the original 5 nuclear weapon states, the US, Russia, UK, France, China, to pursue nuclear disarmament in good faith in exchange for the 186 other countries that are parties to the Non-Proliferation Treaty, committing to not acquire nuclear weapons and to accept IAEA verification. Well, that hasn't happened. I mean, at least we haven't achieved nuclear disarmament in that 50 years, and right now we're not going in that direction anymore. So, partly in reaction to that fact, the 61 countries, mostly in the South, mostly already members of nuclear weapon-free zones, those the blue areas, have just last week had their first meeting in Vienna on the treaty to ban the treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons. And it's interesting to me that you see the nuclear weapon states in red here, and in pink the ones that are not members well, there's different shades of pink. There's Pakistan and India and Israel, which is too small to really see here, and North Korea. And then a lighter shade of pink for the countries in NATO in which U.S. bombs are stationed with at bases with fighter bombers, either fighter bombers of those countries or U.S. fighter bombers. But now, in addition to those countries which have nuclear weapons, there are also about 30 countries which are under the U.S. so-called nuclear umbrella. And that includes NATO, the NATO countries, which don't have weapons, and Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the weapon states have stayed away from the treaty and the meetings on the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. But at this, a few of the umbrella states, the states under the U.S. umbrella, have actually attended. Here I show Australia this last week as observers: Australia, Finland, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. And I think the political struggle there will be now a political struggle in some of these states about whether they should continue to be under the U.S. nuclear umbrella or should join these states in the ban treaty. Okay, so scientists have in fact, there's a whole history, and I'll just briefly give you a brief overview of scientists, especially physicists, who've worked to reduce the nuclear danger. The first was Niels Bohr, who recognized that, I think, what may have been the first to recognize the danger of a Soviet-U.S. nuclear arms race after World War II. And he met with President Roosevelt, Prime Minister Churchill during the war to urge them to talk with Stalin about this secret U.S.-UK nuclear project. It was supposedly secret, but in fact the Soviets had penetrated it with spies. Well, Bohr was ignored. In fact, Churchill reacted with horror at this idea, but he did in fact many in the U.S. nuclear weapons program, many of the physicists with his concerns. Another notable landmark was the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, the last in 1955, the last that Einstein signed a week before his death. And they called, it was Bertrand Russell, the philosopher, mathematician, who wrote this manifesto, and they called on scientists to assemble in conference and appraise the perils that have risen as a result of the development of weapons of mass destruction and discuss a resolution. And out of that initiative came the Pugwash conferences, which during the Cold War were extremely important as a forum in which Western and Soviet scientists met and discussed various possible arms control agreements and laid the basis for a number of them. And this just shows you the lead organizer, Joseph Roplot, and the Pugwash organization shared the Nobel Prize in 1995. Then there was a big uprising, both public and among the scientists, during the atmospheric nuclear testing period, where the radioactive fallout was coming out down all over the world. And two scientists, leading scientists, Linus Pauling, the Nobel Prize physical chemist. Actually, this is a nice picture I like because President Kennedy invited all the U.S. living Nobel Prize winners to dinner in the White House. And before he went in, Pauling ticketed in front against atmospheric nuclear testing. Andrei Sakharov became concerned about this. He was still a weapons designer in the Soviet Union, and he went to Khrushchev and talked about the consequences of fallout, which I've just recently looked at updated his estimate, and it looks like the consequences still mostly in the future from carbon-14, maybe 3 million cancer deaths. They got the atmospheric test ban in 1963. Then these are my two heroes of for the ABM treaty. Hans Bethe and Richard Garwin went public. They were members of the President's Science Advisory Committee, and when the President Johnson made the political decision to deploy U.S. ballistic missile defenses, even knowing that it wouldn't work, just to get the pressure off from the Republican candidate Richard Nixon at the time. Bethe and Garwin went public, and with a Scientific American article explaining the countermeasures to ballistic missile defense, and educating people like me. And in fact, it was their article Scientific American article in 1968, which originally got me engaged in arms control. This is during the Gorbachev period, one of Gorbachev's advisors had the idea, Evgeny Velikov had the idea. Gorbachev started out with a unilateral testing moratorium in the Soviet Union. The Reagan administration didn't want to join in that. They said, well, maybe they're cheating. And so Velikov invited, with Gorbachev's permission, invited a group of U.S. seismologists in. And this shows Velikov with Tom Cochrane, a young physicist who organized the U.S. side of this. And then you see a picture of a group of U.S. seismologists in Kazakhstan, and then on the bottom right you see the first seismogram. I think they did detect a test, but it was in Nevada, not in Kazakhstan. And this shows a congressman holding up the seismogram, and Congress got interested because the Soviet unwillingness to allow in-country inspections had, in fact, prevented the atmospheric test ban from becoming a total test ban. And ultimately, we did get everybody stopped testing in 1996, except for North Korea, which made a few tests and then stopped, hopefully permanently. And then it wasn't just physicists, and I just wanted, for the younger people, want to show them a picture. There was a mass movement in the United States. There was a mass movement in Europe against nuclear weapons in the 80s. People were very concerned at the time about the possibility of nuclear war. And this shows this banner here I'm showing from the US March, showing 177 out of 195 Vermont towns voted for the nuclear arms freeze, which was the rallying cry to freeze the arms race. That shows you the grassroots nature.
Una cliente.
Okay, so now finally I get back to our Physicists Coalition. I've already mentioned that we have about 850 physicists signed up, include from graduate students to faculty, emerituses like me. And we've initially worked on educating Congress on 3 issues. One was extending the US-Russia new strategic arms treaty, which was to expire in February 2021. And President Trump was refusing to extend it. Biden came in and he did very quickly extend it for allowed 5 years, after which it really will expire. We fought against some money that was put in the and succeeded in preventing funding for preparing for resuming nuclear weapons tests during the Trump administration. And we pushed for no first use. Now, on no first use, we persuaded a fair number of Congress people, but the pressure on and this is relevant to you, I think, there's a lot of pressure on the Biden administration, not only from the people who disagreed, the people in Congress who want to so-called keep all options on the table, but for many NATO countries, Japan, South Korea, they wanted the US to keep all options on the table in case, and be able to threaten a nuclear response in case of either a Russian conventional attack, such on NATO, or Chinese attack on its neighbors. So we still do not have a no first use policy. China does, by the way. It's only and India to some extent. But in the past, the U.S. did make nuclear threats in conventional wars. In the 50s, in the Korean War, the Taiwan Straits crises, the Vietnam War, 60s. Those threats were not effective. And today we have Putin making nuclear threats, and I think they have proven to be not effective either in terms of the escalation of assistance that NATO has provided Ukraine. So then I think this is the final slide, and the question is, I'd like to raise the question of the European physicists in Europe doing, creating an organization like ours, or maybe us joining in an international organization, internationalizing the Physicists Coalition. And there is there are nuclear issues in Europe. The role of nuclear weapons in the defense of the U.S. nuclear umbrella, of the U.S. nuclear weapons in Europe, that really are controversial, and the European Parliament and the parliaments in different countries, could play a role in educating their representatives. And we're also in the U.S. we're starting to think about chapters at universities, where to help people facilitate the physicists educating themselves and then working together to educate the government. And so this ends my talk, and I guess we could have a brief Q&A on the issues I've raised, and then I hope for those people who are interested in staying on for a possible discussion of the Physicists Coalition and possible activities, like similar activities in Europe. I hope some of you will stay around for that discussion with our chairman, Stuart Prager, and our manager, Charlotte Sultan. So I'm gonna stop sharing my screen now.
Okay, Frank, many thanks. Please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question on Zoom. Yeah, Rustem.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, thanks a lot for this talk and for this really an important discussion, especially as you said in your talk, at this, what I feel a very dangerous time. Just a bit of background story. So I was born in Kazakhstan, about a few hundred kilometers from the Semipalatinsk site. So my memories from the elementary school is the sensations when a thermonuclear bomb goes off. You really feel it as an earthquake. And when I was in late 80s growing up, this was a frequent occurrence where you really feel this device going off, right? And I remember at the time also we had, since I'd grown up, a major industrial town in the Soviet Union. We were constantly warned that we are on the target list of the United States. And I remember having some kind of a nightmares when I was a child, sort of related to this fact, right? So since then, I studied in Russia, and now I work for a university in China, but I also got my degree from US. So I kind of visited all the countries that many of the countries you mentioned, and now I live in France, which is also nuclear power countries, right? So I felt I had this kind of perspective from different countries where I lived. And I would like add another dimension, because in your talk, you really stayed on physics, really the concrete scientific issues. But what I personally feel, and it's my personal opinion, which I know most people don't share probably, is that this is mostly a political issue, right? Because in many of the examples of countries increasing nuclear weapons, or like in current scenario, right? I felt that the role of some political decisions by United States, expanding NATO to the east, sending the aircraft carrier striker groups close to China's shores, and that's just discussions I had with my Chinese colleagues, right? Does create a threat for other countries, right? So to me, maybe the dimension that I felt is most terrifying for me personally is this, what I see from my background as an aggressive posture by United States and its allies with regard to, as you mentioned, China's expansion is probably a response to United States increasing capabilities and modernizing its arsenal, right? So I support this kind of a more scientific debate, but maybe the main action, from what I see from the third world perspective, like from Kazakhstan, lies maybe in the fact that we're one country in the world which had several aggressive wars, offensive wars in the past 2-3 decades only, that does legitimately creates fear for other countries in the world.
Yeah, I mean, you're right that this is a political issue, but it tends to develop a technical dimension. People say, yes, but we can't do anything else. We can't change anything to make this less dangerous. I fear that there will be pressure now to, in fact, reverse the decline of warheads that we had with the end of the Cold War, and so I think the physicists are useful to explain that, in fact, this is a political issue, and the technical obstacles that are brought up for not changing our postures and not reducing are actually screens to try to keep prevent political action by intimidating people if they don't know what they're talking about. I mean, you're right that the U.S. has led in the nuclear arms race, and struggled to imagine ways in which nuclear threats could be used. other countries, unfortunately, have learned from our example, and so I think we have to back away from these dangerous postures together. Thank you.
Valerie. Valerie Pugac.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. I think that it is very important that you have made it because it reflects the dreams about such presentation from thousands of physicists around the world and especially from Ukraine, which I am coming from. But I think my just opinion is that this education about which you are talking is very important, and we certainly will join you with our pleasure. But isn't it too late? Isn't it the time for presidents to make decisions to stop the moving to the nuclear war, which is really very fast developing? And I have also another, just not question, but proposal. Maybe we have to also to think not only about education of ourselves and our governments and people, but we have to be prepared to the nuclear war. And then other scientists have to be involved into development of the measures how the humanity will survive. Thank you.
Yeah, Valerie, I agree. I think at the moment, we're lucky that we have President Biden and not President Trump. Actually, Biden's instincts are pretty risk averse, and the Biden administration even postponed a practice launch of ICBM. These are done regularly to make sure that the boosters still work. They're shot from a base in California out over the Pacific, and towards the South Pacific, and of course, without a warhead, without a real warhead, and so they've been. President Biden has been quite cautious, but in dealing with the Ukraine situation, that doesn't mean it's still not dangerous. The nuclear dimension of the Ukraine situation. We've seen that the presidents aren't free agents. He actually came into office committed to change the U.S. policy to a no first use policy, which would, I think, have been a great contribution in reducing the danger, and setting a good example today. But he was put under pressure by the NATO allies, by the Congress, and people in Congress who didn't agree, and by Japan, as I mentioned. So it's and he was not. He found that with all the controversies that are going on in the United States right now, and including about the future of our democracy, he just decided he couldn't afford to put the energy into defending a no first use position. He actually had a slightly different formulation. I should mention, it was in the slide. It was called sole purpose. That is, the sole purposes of our weapons are to deter the use of other countries' nuclear weapons. And what follows from that, it's not quite the same as no first use, but what follows from that is that we will give up our nuclear weapons if other countries give up our nuclear weapons, which is obviously a precondition. But even that, the U.S. has not been clear on that, and still is not clear on that. I don't know. I hope that's helpful.
Okay, thank you.
Xinqian?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, thank you for the nice talk. I would have a question regarding to the Korea, North Korea. North Korea, suppose it seems currently North Korea is the only country in the whole world who is still testing real test. Other country has stopped or not. I'm not sure about India and Pakistan. They may have not tested for many years. I don't know whether they promise to not test anymore or this is one question. But Korea, in any case, North Korea always testing. Also, the main problem is North Korea leader do not care anything else. No matter what other country do say anything, he just whatever he want to test, they test it. Also, some people said he is China is behind him, secretly support something, but I'm not sure about that yet. But in any case, apparently, North Korea is still testing and the threat to not only the nuclear test, but also all kinds of missiles, short range, long range. He doesn't care anybody else what our our general physicists can do about that. Whatever we say, they don't care. They never heard. So in that case, if this country is still threat other people, other countries, then do we have any method to any possible things to change unless some people, Mr. King was overthrown or something, but that is not in foreseen future. So that's my question about North Korea. The second question is about China's no first use policy. This was China was declared no first use from the very beginning. But these last few years, there are some voice from China itself, including military or something, saying Chinese no first use policy is stupid and something we should abandon these things. Would you think the real other country, U.S. and the Russian, if Russian would not abandon the first use policy, no, Russia has never declared, never declared the no first use policy. He is still saying if NATO do something, he can use that whatever first use or second use. So that's about the first use. China, I only can say there is some voice from China. Some people in China, including the power people, are saying the previous the no first use policy is stupid. We should not insist that.
I've got your point. Thank you. Just briefly on, you're right. Well, the last on the testing, India and Pakistan last tested and conducted most of their tests that through their entire history within a couple of weeks in 1998.
1998. Wow.
And but North Korea began testing in 2006, and I think the last test was maybe 6 tests total. The last test may have been 2017, but it looks like there are preparations for another test going on, and they have been testing missiles. There were a couple of times when it looked like we could make a deal with North Korea. One was in the 1990s, but it was during the end of the Clinton administration, but the Bush administration didn't want to continue with that. I think Vice President Cheney said, we don't deal with terrorist states, we defeat them, or something like that. China, I think there has been a debate in China on its no first use policy. And Russia, I think, has a policy. Their current policy is that they will not use nuclear weapons unless the existence of the state is at risk. Now, but that what that actually means, whether it means that the future of the Putin regime is at risk, would be potentially one of his interpretations. How should we proceed, Monica?
I would take the last question, but please be synthetic, and then I would go to this for the people who are interested. I would go to this extra session. So there is one question by Gianluca. I would take that, and then I would stop.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Monica, and thank you for the presentation we had today. My question is related to global wars. After the Second World War, we fortunately didn't have anymore any global war, even if we had several smaller wars, like the one we are having in Ukraine, for example, right now. Now, I have to say that I fear very much what Putin is doing in Ukraine, but I also fear, let's say, the aggressive policy that Biden is having against Putin. Now, my question is, if the world didn't have any nuclear weapon right now, you think we would be closer to a possible third world war, or will be more distant?
That's a issue which is debated. When people within our nuclear complex argue that in fact having nuclear weapons has reduced the reason they described the long peace since the end of World War II, the long peace in terms of war between the industrialized countries, as being due to nuclear weapons. And therefore they say that, in fact, thanks to nuclear weapons, the number of people dying every year in war on average has gone down. This is a very controversial statement, but I think you can ascribe other reasons to war going down. I think we're much more vulnerable. Societies are much more vulnerable, not just to nuclear weapons, but to other things. I mean, and in fact, I give the example, Chernobyl. Gorbachev thought that one of the reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union was Chernobyl. Which much smaller event than a nuclear war. I've estimated that maybe 10,000 people will die from cancer as a result of Chernobyl. But it was traumatic for all of Europe, and certainly in the Soviet Union. So and we also now we keep creating new vulnerabilities. We now are vulnerable to cyber war, cyber attack. So I think there are many reasons, in addition to threatening the future of civilization with nuclear war, for not having, for being deterred from having a world war, even in the absence of nuclear weapons. But I think, this is hardly discussed, and I'd like to see it discussed more.
Okay, so how do you want to proceed with the second part?
Well, what I'd like to suggest is that Stuart Prager and Charlotte Sultan make themselves visible, and that maybe Stuart could say, if I've said my version already about the coalition. Maybe he could start by adding anything and that he wants to say, and then maybe if people want to discuss the coalition and whether whether they're financially interested in doing something similar or joining us in some way, maybe we could have that, invite that discussion.
Oh, okay, Frank, thank you. This is Stuart Prager. I'll just talk for 2 minutes and then open it up. A couple of years ago, we started this Physicists Coalition. The thought was, what can we do for this problem? And we thought, as physicists, we have a special link to this problem, no more individual responsibility. But we thought that if physicists speak in a collective way on this issue, our voice can be influential among policymakers. Justified or not, we're viewed as connected and maybe having some special insights into this problem, justified or not. And thus, we thought we could be effective in changing a political opinion. So we formed this coalition with 2 goals, as Frank said. One is to re-engage, educate the physics community, and I think we've been doing that through 112 colloquia presented in physics departments and national labs in the US. And then we've been advocating, and we started up and been sponsored by the American Physical Society. So we've been lobbying or advocating through their government affairs office. It's been very useful. So we think now that we're standing and on our feet, clearly this is an international problem. The US has almost half of the world's nuclear weapons, but there are 8 other countries with nuclear weapons. And as Frank said, there's another 30 that are participating in this nuclear weapons world complex through the nuclear umbrella of the US. And clearly every country on the planet would be affected adversely by nuclear war. So clearly, as we all know, it's an international problem. So what we think we have a model that's begun to work. A long way to go yet, but we set up this coalition in the United States, and we'd like to now start a dialogue with our physicist counterparts in other countries. And I might mention, we're a Physicists Coalition, and there's all physicists on the line here today, but our coalition in the US is open to anybody who views themselves as a physical scientist, astronomers, earth scientists, and people in engineering science on the physical end of it. So we'd like to just engage with our counterparts in other nations on what can be done, as what we can do as physicists internationally. And I will stress that we're not at all just speaking to physicists who happen to have expertise in arms control, quite the opposite. Just with some information, any physicist can effectively speak out on this issue. There are many things that can be done. One, we can just have a dialogue, which could be informative. Perhaps, as Frank said, there could be some kind of coalitions established in other countries, appropriately adapted to that country. We can imagine having multinational efforts trying to inform our governments, or just maybe even informing our public. At the very least, some dialogue. So what we like to do right now is just open up a dialogue. And how do we do that internationally? So for starters, I know that Charlotte put Frank's email, my email, and her email in the chat. So if you're interested in being part of a discussion of what we can do beyond today, you can send any of us an email. And as I say, I encourage you, you don't have to have any expertise on nuclear weapons. That's not the point. Just be a physical scientist of interest. So I would just say, when we do quit, those that are interested in continuing just a brainstorming discussion of what can be done, send us your email. And with that, I'll stop. And I don't know if Charlotte or Frank wants to continue on or just open it up right now.
Maybe open it up. Charlotte, we do have a website. You might, have you put in the information on that? Okay, in the chat. And so maybe if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, Francesco Forte.
Hi, I'm Francesco Forti from Pisa, and I just wanted to let people know that actually in Italy there is an association which has very similar goals. It's called the USPID. It's the Union of Scientists for Disarmament. It was actually, I'm the national secretary of that association, and it was founded in 1982 at the time of the missile crisis in Europe. And it's been trying to educate people in the schools and universities and lobbying for disarmament with, relatively minor successes, but a lot of frustration. But I think that's a common observation. We have people on our scientific council. We have people like Francesco Calogero, who was the Pugwash secretary in 1995, and the current Pugwash secretary, who's Paolo Cotta-Lamusino. So we have very knowledgeable people to carry these activities. We have about 80 associates, and but I've seen 10 additional associates in the past 2 weeks, which indicates a clear interest in this thing. So I'm really looking forward to interacting with the coalition and understanding if we can have joint action and reinforce the activity. So I will send you email. Actually, I have to leave in a few minutes, but I'll send you email so that we can get in touch.
Thank you. That sounds great. Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
I think there's also a German organization. I forget within the German Physical Society. Thank you.
I thought also that the Accademia dei Lincei organizes events.
Yeah, Monica, that's right. Yeah, there is the Amaldi conferences.
The Amaldi conference, yes.
That are organized every, I think, 3 years by the Accademia dei Lincei, and the president of that is Luciano Maiani of that organization. So yeah, there's a group on international security and arm control at the Accademia dei Lincei. Yes.
So it would seem to me that the first thing is to make an inventory of what already exists and establish links.
Yes, that's a good idea.
Right. Actually, there is even a European organization. It's called the European Union of Non-Proliferation, something EUNPD, and that is a European umbrella where many of these organizations are connected together. So actually, that could be a good point to connect to the European effort. It's a bit wider than the physicists. It's encompassing a lot of other disciplines and scientists. But it's a good starting point.
Francesco, would you be willing to try to organize a Zoom meeting where we could have a discussion?
Yeah, let's try to do that.
That'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, any other comments or ideas? So Stuart will also be presenting this initiative at the IUPA Centenary Symposium in 2 weeks from now in Trieste at ICTP.
That's great. Well, maybe if people don't have additional questions and they do have the information, contact information, maybe we should declare victory.
I'll just make one final comment. what we've been doing, as has been said in the United States, is we have a team of about a dozen physicists who go around and have given colloquia at US universities, mostly by Zoom to date. And I think that team of 12 would be happy to do it at universities or laboratories, as Frank just did, outside of the US. So if people would like at their universities or labs other than CERN to have a talk, I'm sure we can supply it.
Okay. Karen.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much, Frank, for your really thought-provoking talk. I don't know if you remember me from Pugwash.
Yes.
Hello everybody. I'm in Argentina, in Bariloche, in the southern part of Argentina. I just wanted to say very shortly that we have recently formed Pugwash, regional Pugwash groups like Pugwash Argentina and Pugwash Brazil and Pugwash Latin America. So really they are independent of Pugwash, in their actions. So we want to be more regional, but we will be very happy to connect with you, and the congratulations for this initiative. I think is very important. I am a physicist myself, so I will be very happy to follow your activities. Thank you so much for everything. Very important.
Karen, maybe can I make the same proposal to you that I made to Francesco? Maybe can we organize a Zoom meeting with the people who with those organizations?
With pleasure, great pleasure, Frank. Yes, we're here. I mean, we're far. We're in the southern cone. But I think we all have to be involved, and it's difficult, reaching the public here because they think things are happening very far away, and there are topics that are not related to Latin Americans or to Argentinians, and I think we have to reverse that. So very happy to collaborate with all of you.
Well, and you now have the ban treaty activism, so there must be they must feel more relevant now.
Yes, of course.
And you have made all of Latin America nuclear weapons free, which is not a bad thing.
No, not at all. But Argentina is the only country, I think, except for some from Suriname or some other country in South America that hasn't signed not even ratified, of course, the treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So we have to try to change that. And I don't know if it is a political moment, but I think it would be important to try to bring some concepts and to try to change their minds.
Well, thank you. I hope we will hear from you about the possibility of a Zoom brainstorming session.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else?
So I might just briefly chime in and say, if anyone isn't quite sure yet how they might want to collaborate, but wants to stay up to date with what we're doing, we did drop the link in the chat where you can join the coalition. That basically just means that we'll include you on our emails. So you'll get our newsletters. You'll also get invited to our webinars, journal clubs, activities that you could engage in no matter where you are in the world. So just throwing that out as another option for folks who maybe aren't ready to commit to the level of engagement that Karen and Francesco are already doing.
All right, many thanks, Charlotte. Okay, so
can I say something?
Eric,
Yes,
Eric.
My hand is dropped all the time. Let me turn on the video so you can see me maybe. Yeah. No, I in talking to Russian colleagues and other colleagues, in our experiments, I've discovered that there's a lot of there are big cultural differences between, let's say the West, United States, Western Europe, and the East, Russian, Russia and China. And I think, what we call our values are not at all, considered as such by the other countries. And it seems to me that, the only way to get out of this impasse is to unilaterally, start massively disarming. If we get rid of all our nuclear weapons in the West, then what is perceived as an unnecessary provocation by us, but very provocative by the East, surely this will disappear. So what are we doing, to persuade our politicians to unilaterally disarm? I think that is what we have to do, and okay, we can establish links and so on and keep on talking forever, but I think the time, and really particularly now, I'm extremely worried by the situation in Ukraine, and people with different ideas and different values, they will do things which we consider crazy, but they, think that they're heroes. So is anything happening? And if so, how can we join? It was a general question. Anybody who wants to answer can answer.
I don't think anything is happening on that scale, and so, but I agree with you that ultimately, just it's necessary to just say no to nuclear weapons, and that takes courage. People then bring all sorts of arguments up about well, what about this makes it free to whoever keeps nuclear weapons, makes it easier for them to threaten, and even if everybody does say
you're welcome. Hang on a second. I'll just call you back in a moment because okay. Cheers.
Anyway, there's a whole debate that your proposal starts, which includes ultimately what if everybody agreed that they would get rid of nuclear weapons, and how do we know that they're not cheating? And so there's plenty of work, unfortunately, for physicists to do to deal with these issues.
Can I make a quick comment? Our coalition, from the last 2 years and up until October, were sponsored and under the auspices of the American Physical Society. So by that, anything we lobby for has to be approved by the APS. And then reasonably so, APS is a scientific society that we've been constrained to lobbying for very significant, but compared to what you're saying, incremental actions, such as US adopting a no first use policy. But beginning in October, we can really advocate for whatever we think is most effective. So the kind of question you're raising, I think, can be discussed in a useful way from a coalition parochial point of view post-October. And that's exactly the kind of discussion I think would be useful to have across international boundaries by physicists. So I would just urge you to kind of discuss that with us, not in a philosophical way, but in a sense of what the coalition or analogs to that in other countries can do.
And I guess I'd like to add that we have webinars, and I think and some if you add your name to Charlotte's list, you'll receive announcements of our webinars when we discuss these, and I think we will discuss the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons in one of our not too distant future webinars.
Okay, thank you.
Rustem, brief comment.
I just agree with the previous comment on the disarmament, but I would also extend it to the conventional weapons because, again, perspective that I've seen and I share that the massive misbalance or disbalance in conventional weapons capabilities encourages some countries like North Korea, for example, in my view, to develop nuclear capabilities, Iran as well, to balance out the fact that in conventional weapons, they vastly inferior. So if we're going to start in disarmament part, maybe reducing this misbalance of conventional weapons between certain countries in the world would be the first step that will really create a trust, in my opinion. Unfortunately, we're not going in that direction at the moment, especially with this war, which I personally find extremely worrying, also because what's happening within Russia in terms of political development there. But unilateral steps for the one side, I think, would make a major difference in the climate that will create new capabilities.
No, you're right, In fact, the commitment that the 5 original nuclear weapon states made in the Non-Proliferation Treaty was to pursue nuclear disarmament and general and complete disarmament. And it's been interpreted by some as saying we have to create the conditions for nuclear disarmament, which includes reducing the perceptions of threat of conventional attack by countries which have nuclear weapons. So you're quite right that everything is connected to this debate, and which makes, of course, which is why, of course, it's so. One of the reasons it's so difficult. So thank you, Monica, and thank you, everybody.
Thanks to you. I think it was useful. Some contacts were established, and hopefully they will lead to some partnerships. And yeah, many thanks again, Frank and Stuart and Charlotte.
Thank you, Monica. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye. So I close.
Yes.
I close.